All right, welcome everyone. It is April 23rd, and this is the ESIP Soil Ontology and Informatics Cluster. Today we're going to hear a presentation from Nick Jelinski about the Alaskan soil database. So take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, and happy to share what we've been up to. So I'm Nick Jelinski. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And I'm the lead on this, what is really a highly collaborative project, going beyond even the logos here at the top, but on consolidating large amounts of soil and soil adjacent data across Alaska for the purposes of modeling spatial and depth distributions of soil properties. I know typically a lot of the projects in this group have been very carbon focused, and we are certainly consolidating carbon data, but we're not limited to carbon data. So any soil property, even morphological soil properties from the field, we're also very interested in. So I'll give a little bit of background on the project. It is highly collaborative. There's federal agencies, Forest Service, NRCS. This is an NRCS funded project. So in 2022, we got the funding for this, and this is finishing this year. So we've started to release a couple preliminary things, and hopefully will continue to be. But my intent is to continue to maintain this on a just keep the lights on level. At least for the next, 5 years or so. So I plan to keep being involved on this specific data project. But yes, we got federal agencies, several institutions, University of Alaska Anchorage. We've had a lot of contributors from University of Alaska Fairbanks as well. ABR is a for-profit consulting company up in Alaska with a large database of soils data. And we're bringing together both private and public data in this. So we've had to also encounter these issues of data sharing agreements, non-disclosure agreements. We have some tribal data. We have some data from private industry. And so dealing with that is, of course, is also a challenge, but we've kind of found some ways to work around it. And I also want to acknowledge some of the major data contributors. So Chen Luping, who was a soil scientist at UAF, pedologist at UAF for a long time, Yuri Scher, Misha Konevsky, Tor Jorgensen, Dave Swanson. A lot of folks worked on consolidated large amounts of data on soils and throughout Alaska throughout their careers. And then collaborators at Department of Energy, USGS, and NRCS. So the reason we got funded for this is that there's an initiative called Soils 2026 that USDA NRCS has had since, I could be wrong, but about 2018. And the idea was basically, we've been doing soil surveys since 1899 in the US, and it's time to have a complete seamless digital soil map across the United States that's available in Web Soil Survey, which is the publicly accessible platform for soil survey data in the United States, both point data and the actual map units delineations on the ground. And so this is dated now, but if you look at this, this is these are the areas of the United States that were not up to standards and or not complete as of 2022. So a lot of these have started to be completed because of this initiative. But basically Alaska accounts for over 80% of the unmapped lands in the US, and even beyond that, it's probably now more because many of these have started to be completed. So 80 to 90% of the unmapped lands are in Alaska. Very limited data, of course, from many remote areas. Also, of course, important because vast majority of US permafrost is in Alaska. There are questions about infrastructure stability, which can tie back to soil data, and of course the carbon questions that are a major focus in the academic literature. I'm gonna be skipping through some of these, likely to cut this down a little bit, but because once I get into the guts of it, you guys know how this is. You could talk for hours, so I'm not gonna do that. So I may be skipping some things, but I'm also happy to share my slides if we want to post them. So again, this is an NRCS funded project. If you look at where soil mapping efforts have been in Alaska through USDA NRCS, which, NRCS usually is collecting the most complete, comprehensive data, just in terms of staffing, long-term efforts, laboratory analysis. The National Soil Information Service Database, NASIS, and the Kellogg Soil Survey Laboratory data is a big source of what feeds into ISCN, especially in Alaska, among other things. Particularly in Alaska, it's heavily weighted to the NRCS data. So if we look at the distribution of completed surveys, and again, this is dated now, it's June 2020. There's been a couple areas that have been added since then, and especially these in progress areas, some of them have been completed. But this would be the completed soil survey areas. The point data that's been collected, not surprisingly, aligns very closely with the soil survey areas. And so there's huge gaps in spatial coverage, lots of data in this database, 35,000 data points. But of course, there's huge gaps in spatial coverage. So our pitch in this proposal was, hey, and this is again dated, I'll show you a more updated example of where we're at with point data consolidation. But there's all of these other data sets that are soil adjacent data sets in Alaska, federal agencies, academic data sets that have quite a bit of coverage in areas that are not well represented in the NASIS database. So if we could harmonize, synthesize those two in some way to create a point data product that could be used for modeling, we could do a lot more across Alaska. So that was really the genesis of the project and the pitch. It was funded. We're doing all of our data sort of work on the University of Minnesota Supercomputing Institute GEMS platform. GEMS stands for Genetics, Environment Management, and Socioeconomics. I guess we're doing environment, but it's just the acronym. This is basically just a data platform that was stood up by the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute to deal with private and public data sets in different ways. So it respects data sensitivities. It has corporate data security standards. And so there are private-public partnerships like with PepsiCo and other things that have utilized this data platform. And it is funded in large part with relatively stable funding from the state of Minnesota in the longer term. So at least for now, at least for our purposes, the timeline of this project, it was a good data platform to use to consolidate data from many different sources, some of which are private, some of which are completely open and public, and try to put them together in one place where we can be sure that we're respecting all these different data sensitivities. There's some tools that you can use in the platform that we've kind of moved away from, but there's some other things that you can do on this platform. The main idea was to acquire, curate, and harmonize then non-NRCS soil adjacent legacy data across the state of Alaska, and deliver it, at least the publicly available stuff, to NRCS, to NASIS, and potentially into WOSIS, and potentially any other large data compilations that may, where Alaska soils data is poorly represented, especially in WOSIS. Alaska soils data is very poorly represented. And that's led to some weird outcomes for Alaska when people have done global modeling. Alaska usually looks pretty strange from what we would expect. So our main goals are to source the raw data in a transparent way. So we either pull directly from a publicly available published referenceable data set with a DOI, or we have quite a few data sets that are not published. In fact, I would say maybe at least 60% of our data sets are not published, not findable in any way, not even published in a journal, for example. And these ones, we've created a data package with metadata and a DOI. We don't modify the raw source data when we ingest it. We focus on enriching and enhancing the metadata in particular, and making sure that it's consistent across data sets. And we're really using, I guess, from, Kathy, your work in the paper, we're really using like a keyed translation method of harmonization. So all of our harmonization is being done via scripting. And I'll show some examples of that, at least some of the stages. And then the idea is a single package of point data that can be used for modeling and potentially delivery into other large data compilation efforts. Our goal is to not hold this as its own thing eventually, but rather have it move into something that's maybe more stable, that's not solely grant funded. So here's where we're at right now. This is always a moving target. So I have these little tildes, and I've got, there's other data sets that I don't have listed here, but we have about 80,000 some independent points within, not independent, but 80,000 some actual points within the databases so far that we've consolidated. But there's a significant amount of overlap. So as I mentioned before, just as one example, in ISCN, very focused on carbon, there's a huge overlap between ISCN and what's in the NRCS NASIS database. And so, not all of these 80,000 points are completely separate. However, in some data sets, the same point might have slightly different data, not different in terms of like a totally different, not totally different data, but maybe one data set has carbon data, for example, for a particular point. Another data set may have all the morphological data, but no carbon data. And so dealing with these sort of issues for these large number of data sets is also challenging. So we started, actually, I started leaning a lot on sock drawer and soil drawer data models and WOSIS to start, but we ran into some issues largely because of the types of data that some of these data sets have for Alaska. I'll show examples of that. But, one issue with a lot of permafrost affected soils is that we've got overlapping layers or horizons. We can have broken horizons. We have hundreds of, like maybe 500 plus representations of soils that are in 2 dimensions. I'll show some examples of that have really nice laboratory data, but it's a 2-dimensional thing, sometimes a hand-drawn figure. And so how do we make all of this stuff talk to each other and synthesize it in a meaningful way? That's really the big challenge. So we sort of, since last fall, have been continuously updating our data model and working more. And we had some curated data sets that we went back and updated. And so I think I'll show some examples of that. But here's just an example of some of the 2-dimensional challenges. So here's a representation of a soil profile to about 1 meter depth. This is from the North Slope of Alaska. This is a drawing by Chin-Lu Ping. And so the great thing about this is there's actually laboratory data in triplicate, carbon, nitrogen, lots of laboratory data associated with each of these horizons. But there is no way that you can take this drawing and just, you can condense it to 1 dimension, but you're going to lose a lot of information when you do that. You'd have to, maybe say, okay, we're just going to, give a range of depths, and, you'd have to do a little bit ballparking to just manually condense it. And again, there's hundreds of really good laboratory characterization profiles across the northern part of Alaska that, may look like this. And so this is a huge challenge. So if we try to condense this to 1 dimension, like we would assume most soils profile data is delivered, there's some issues. And initially we were treating these as a special case and not really sure how we would deal with them. And then we kind of flipped the script. So what we've done now is we've treated 2-dimensional representations of soils as actually the standard case. And I'll show an example of how this works. So we actually produce now, for every point observation, we produce what we call a pedon morphological model, which is a JSON companion file for each pedon observation. And it's basically just a condensed numerical matrix that represents a raster version, a rasterized version of, for example, this two-dimensional representation where there's unique IDs in each of the cells, each of the pixels of the raster that reference a tabular, like horizon table or sample table that would allow you to then reach out from the raster, pull data in, and then you can work with it in many different ways. And so if we have a one-dimensional representation of a soil, which is most cases, well, it's just a simplified version of this, right? It's just it's essentially a raster with one column, just a raster with one column and a single depth. So by flipping it a little bit and making this a standard case and producing these JSON companion files, we can actually then represent and harmonize all of the data that we have in our database. Let me see if I have, hold on a second. Yeah, so as an example of this, so this is the drawing. And again, there's laboratory data associated with each of these. That drawing would then be rasterized, which is, of course, something that needs to be done manually. That raster then is burned in with, what's burned into that raster is actually an ID. So each of the cells in the raster actually is burned in as a numerical matrix, the ID of the either sample or horizon that ties back to the tabular data that might be carbon data or soil texture data or pH or whatever. And so, you can imagine then this raster can easily just be a numerical matrix where, each entry here is just a cell and it's as wide as it is. We do it centimeter by centimeter. So it's as many centimeters as this representation is wide. There's that many entries per row. So it's just a numerical matrix that has the same dimensions in centimeters as the profile that we have. And then, so these objects are not huge. You can see the IDs. So you start storing these text strings and they get a little bit larger. But for example, this representation as an example, it's like 1.7 megabytes to store this in this numerical form. And then we compress that further into a JSON representation where, so for example, I don't know if it's exactly the same here, but so what this means over on the right is, so in the 0 to 2 centimeter across this entire thing, there's this value first occurs 35 times, or this string occurs 35 times, then this string occurs 48 times, this string occurs 38 times. So it's just a condensed way to represent the numerical matrix. And this is about 100 times smaller than this numerical matrix, and it's all the relevant information's there. So this can get further down to like 25 kilobytes. So when we have, 80,000, point data, PET-on observations, and we have these JSON companion files for each of them that we've scripted to generate, it's pretty tiny. I mean, I think I was able to generate these for all of them in no more than 5 minutes. And we do this for one-dimensional and two-dimensional objects would have this file. So the advantage of that is that then we can do things like if we want to get the carbon, so, if we have this representation and all of these morphological units, all these different horizons, these irregular horizons in this particular permafrost soil have different carbon values, how in the heck do you ever pull out an average carbon value, for example, from 0 to 20 centimeters, or carbon stock to 1 meter, for example, to use for modeling? The nice thing about having a numerical matrix is then we just can take the IDs, pull out, let's say we're interested in organic carbon. Well, you just pull in the organic carbon values, replace the ID with the organic carbon values, and then you can do all sorts of things. You can weight. So if I want to know the top 20 centimeter average carbon, I can just weight that literally numerically. Can just do some means, standard deviations, those sorts of things. And then that way, all of this can talk to each other. We can do the same sorts of data we would derive from the one-dimensional representations, we can derive from the two-dimensional representations. And in the end, the computational time is very minimal to do that. And so this is one way that we've tried to solve these sorts of issues. And then, Kathy, how much time do I have? I don't want to take me too far here.
There are 25 minutes left in the hour, so 5, 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll just highlight a couple other things. So basically, the workflow that we have for each data set, we have a 5-level workflow. So we have the raw data, which is literally the raw data files as they are either published or as they were delivered to us. Because we're doing keyed translation, we have an annotations file, and we built some of that structure off of SoilDrawer, I think, but that's where I want to connect a little bit more moving forward, and hear more about SoilDrawer and also SockDrawer, and make sure that we're trying to do things in a similar way. It may not be exactly the same, but you all have done so much that there's a lot to lean on. And then a metadata file, which is basically an XML. So our level 0 data is the raw data as delivered, which is usually in CSV tables, the annotations file, which I'll show an example of, and then a metadata file, whether we created it or whether it was part of the data set. And then we go through several levels. We clean it. We have to, of course, understand what the no data values are, things like that, map it to our schema. We produce IDs for the PEDON or the point observations, the horizons, the samples, correct some errors. We generate these PEDON morphological models. We get more towards a harmonized ready data set at level 4, where we have our data tables that are in our data model, which is a PEDON table, horizon table, and a sample table for every data set. And then our level 5 data is essentially it's one single model ready PEDON, horizon, sample tables that can be used that don't have spatial overlap for any points that may be overlapping. So that's what we go in, and every one of these, just as an example, every one of these for any one data set, we have the data as it moves through the levels, and then we have the scripts that were used. And we're doing this all in Python. So we have the scripts that were used to move the data through the levels. So in theory, not that anybody's going to have time or interest to do this, but in theory, you could go back through from the model ready data set and actually reconstruct exactly what happened with the data. There's no manual manipulation that we're doing. There might be some case specific things, but they're all going to be in our scripts. So obviously quite a bit of work. We know that 90+% of the work of even some of the spatial modeling that we're doing is just dealing with the data, and so a lot of work that goes into each data set for these. The annotations file, I think, may be similar to what SoilDrawer, SockDrawer have done, but basically we have a data set ID reference. We list, this is just an example with some, but we list all the tables that are in that data set, the columns that are given in the data set, and then here's our keyed translation. So here we're translating these to our, in our data model, our field names and our associated output tables. Variable types, units, methods. So of course, something like carbon, we could have multiple methods. And here we're leaning on the NRCS method codes. So this like C1, B1, C1, C2, other things. And then in this case, we're actually putting the units in the annotations file. So the native units that as it was delivered actually end up in the annotations file, which we can reach into, and if we need to harmonize or approximate units, things like that. And some other, for numerical variables, some things that are high and low values that we can use for checks later on. So I just want to highlight here. Yeah, so we do have a data use and co-authorship agreement, and that is available. We have a GitHub site up for the project that needs to be updated. It's woefully out of date. It's probably my last update was probably November, December. But eventually, we're going to be shipping these level 5 dataset versions, the public stuff. There's quite a bit that's private that we can't release, but the public stuff we're going to ship, and at least temporarily, it'll be a zip that includes list of all co-authors, contributors that should be contacted if anybody's using the data, acknowledgements, license, that sort of thing. Right now, we haven't done that yet. It's all internal to our working group because we've also been using some of this data to predict soil properties and classes at 10-meter resolution across the state. So using a few different machine learning model approaches, covariates, we have curated. So I don't know, Sophia, if you guys are doing any modeling, but if anybody doing spatial modeling interested in Alaska, we have this huge, it's about 12 terabytes of covariates that are all standardized, aligned 10 meters that we've used both for this project and the AK-Veg project that's working in parallel, focused on vegetation. And then our point data set, of course, our curated level 5 harmonized point data set. And then we're working on predicting then a number of these target variables. And so this is really the outcome for, in addition to the data itself, but USDA, just as an example, so statewide prediction of soil classes. Here's more yellow. This is the viridis color scheme. So yellow or green is higher probability of occurrence. So andisols, which are volcanic soils, mostly along the western Aleutians, Kodiak Island, parts of south central. Gelisols are permafrost soil affected soils, of course, interior northern Alaska, mostly Copper River Basin, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So our patterns, at least with our initial version of our harmonized data set, seem reasonable. So we're continually adding data at this point and trying to improve these models. This is all at 10-meter resolution. And so here's just an example of the same models, but this is now gelisol permafrost affected soil prevalence near Bethel, which is in Western Alaska. So even at the landscape scale, the predictions look pretty good. And so that's sort of our end delivery to NRCS as part of this project is predictions of statewide soil properties and soil classes, the data synthesis object itself, and associated metadata. And then we're modeling things really like there's an interest in carbon folks. There's some folks at Department of Energy that are working on that. But really my interest is in soil properties beyond carbon. So we're looking at potentially trying to model ground ice content, near surface permafrost. This is an older example from my colleague Neil Pastic about 10 years ago, but I think we'll be able to improve on this. Soil texture, pH, those sorts of things. So yeah, I think I'm over time. We do have a GitHub Pages site with an ebook. I'm happy to share my materials, Kathy, and also this is a living project still. So we believe that this will be finished. Well, it'll be delivered, and anyway, the grant will be done in the end of September. But my plan is to sort of keep working on it as I can.
Thank you. All right, let's roll into some clarifying questions, and then we're going to stop the recording and go into open discussion. So does anyone have any clarifying questions for Nick before we close out? I have a question. I'm always curious how people deal with geoprecision. So how do you deal with reported lat long, especially for some of older
okay.
points?
Yes, big problem. So we have I didn't show this, but we developed a geospatial data quality ranking.
Okay.
So the best that we're doing is basically, especially because this is a synthesis of data, wide range of origin. Some of these are pinpricks on aerial photos that were done as part of soil survey, that were then geo-referenced by somebody manually. So others of them have been recently collected and have great, excellent precision on a GPS. And so we have I think it's a 5-level geospatial data quality ranking that's assigned usually on a data set level.
Mhm.
Sometimes if the data sets were collected within a data set, they were collected differently, we'll assign them to the subcomponents, but that is at least a flag so that we can somebody could at least, in a modeling scenario say, well, let's just experiment and let's only use the ones that are these tier 1,
Mhm.
more modern 6-foot precision or so. But we don't actually, I was talking to the folks at WOSIS, we don't actually have like a uncertainty value
Mm.
simply because there are some data sets, obviously the more modern ones, you can mine those out, but there's a lot where that's missing. And
Mhm.
also there's a lot where you just have no hope of ever, like it would just be a complete swag to even put something in there. And so we decided that we would just flag with some geospatial data quality and sort of leave it up to the user to decide
Mhm.
how they're going to essentially use that. And that will be in our documentation for the data set as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah, huge
Right.
problem.
Any other clarifying questions? All right. With that, thank you, Nick. I'm going to hit stop on the recording.